Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our third Zoom Artist Talk of the season. My name is Angel Kleiman, and I'm the director of the Rosemary, Duffy, Larson Gallery at Broward College. And tonight we will be speaking with Mary Claire Becker and Taryn McMahon as they share their insights, process, and inspiration behind their two-person exhibition, Hyperreal Landscape. The exhibition runs through April 7th, both live in the gallery and virtually through browardvpa.com. Welcome, Mary Claire and Taryn. And Taryn, I know you're going to go first, so you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Angel. Thanks for hosting the show, first of all, and for being a really great sport and collaborator in terms of setting up the installations for us since we couldn't be there in person. Yeah, and thanks to everybody here for attending this talk. I'm sad I couldn't do it in person, but I'm glad that you all are here and joining us right now. So I'm going to start with a little bit about myself. So I'm currently an associate professor at Kent State University, and I received my MFA from the University of Iowa, which is where Mary Claire also received her MFA. And we've sort of crossed paths several times over the years. We weren't in grad school together, but we've seen each other at shows and conferences, and because we're both alumni of the same program, we've sort of run into each other again and again. And so it's so fun to finally be able to show with her because I've admired her work for a long time. So so my work as an artist observes and documents my interactions with the natural world. I grew up in a working class household in New Jersey, and I try to be really honest and critical about those interactions that I have with the natural world and to share them through my artworks. Does everybody have access to a chat? I'm going to start by asking you all to imagine nature. All right. So just close your eyes for a minute. I'm going to trust that you're doing this because I can't see you. Hold your eyes and create a picture in your mind of what nature is. All right. If you all have done that now, go ahead and open your eyes. And I'm just curious if you would write in the chat a really brief description of what you pictured. Really brief. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. Infinite space, a cliff near the beach, a forest, a beautiful wooded space with pine trees, calm green trees, redwood trees, trees and birds and butterflies. I love this. Another forest, grandparents' home. Oh, that's interesting. Grandparents' garden. All right. Lots of forests, some gardens, peaceful open spaces. That was mentioned a couple times, infinite space. Did anybody picture yourself? It's okay, I probably wouldn't have either, but I'm really curious about that idea. I'm curious about how we as humans envision ourselves as outside of nature. I think one person mentioned their grandparents' home on the top of a hill. Oh, that was you, Angel. And that's really unusual because I do this at a lot of my talks. I start with this, and people don't imagine man-made things at all. There's no houses, there's no pencils or trim. It's like entirely separate from anything that has to do with the world that we've created. And so I'm curious about that. And I think that oftentimes we place ourselves as separate from the natural world, and that is what creates a space culturally and mentally in which we can then interact with the natural world in a dominating and often destructive way. It becomes a backdrop for human pursuits and not something within which we exist or that we're intimately connected to or something that has its own agency. So that very idea of nature that we have, that picture that you pictured in your mind, and the idea that that is what nature is, that is itself a man-made idea. And of course, that has political, social, and ecological implications. I'm going to share my screen now. and bring this up. Play from current slide. Okay. All right. Can you all see that? Thumbs up. Okay. This is Thomas Cole's The Oxbow View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm from 1836. So I'm acutely aware of how the images and historical art that I've seen has shaping my fantasies about nature and what nature is and what it isn't. From the Hudson River School to early botanical engravings, art has shaped and really molded my idea of what I think nature is. And when we think of nature, a lot of what influences our minds comes from this history of art or from the invention of artists, either fine art photography or historical paintings or even prints. In my own work as a printmaker, I think a lot about early botanical woodcuts, especially in engravings, and their legacy. In her book, The Insect and the Image, Janice Neary coined the term specimen logic to refer to the framing devices that artists often used in these works. An insect or a plant would be separated from its entire environment, from its entire surrounding ecology, and rendered in very stiff and exquisite detail, often centered on the page. And I'm interested in this tendency to separate, classify, and categorize the natural world and how that prevents a holistic or ecological viewpoint of interactions. And I think we're really just now waking up to this idea that, we're in a vast entangled mesh, and those systems are really important, and no one thing exists in isolation. So in my work, I try to think of that as being very interested in the mesh itself, the environment itself, the surroundings, the entanglement, the space between things, and not so much, an artwork that would have a very distinct subject. Of course, there are subjects in my work, but this idea of my work as being a background or being an environment rather than something more like a portrait, it comes back to my work again and again. Ooh. There we go. So before photography, a lot of prints were widely studied and used by scientists for the classification of species, which was being newly developed at the time. If a scientist or even a regular person couldn't travel someplace themselves, they could still buy a print, which was, made in multiples, and they could experience the flora and fauna of a place that they couldn't actually be in. So I'm really interested in the idea of prints in being used in that way, because I think it's really akin to the internet for us now. We can experience any place in the world without ever leaving home. We're doing it right now. We're, connecting and interacting through images or through something that's very mediated. It's not a direct experience. I'm very interested in that. And the idea of experiencing an exotic landscape or a dislocated environment really interests me, and it's a really big part of my work again. So I'm also really interested in early photography, like these cyanotypes by Anna Atkins, who used photography and print to document the ecology of her time. In a way, I feel like I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm trying to document what I see as the ecology of my time. So in his book, Ecology Without Nature, Timothy Morton says, "It is an art that the fantasies we have about nature take shape and dissolve." Morton argues that in order to have a properly ecological worldview, we need to really urgently dispense with this idea of nature altogether, that it's too romantic, too unlinked from reality and from ourselves. And a great example of this is the debate that often crops up around building wind farms. People often complain, that the huge turbines will ruin the landscape. And what they mean by that is that it will ruin how it looks. What we think beautiful nature should look like, that picture in your head from earlier of that's nature, and I don't want to ruin that. So sometimes our idea of nature and our love for it actually gets in the way of doing something that is beneficial ecologically. So I'm very aware as an artist that my work is part of this lineage of landscape art and nature images that collectively shapes what we think nature is and what we think it isn't. And I like to think that my work reveals and dissolves fantasies about nature and makes room for shaping new ones. So this is an image from the Cleveland Botanical Garden, which is where I get a lot of images that I use in my artworks. I love that I can go there, and in Cleveland in the middle of the winter, like this winter that has been kind of brutal, I can experience a rainforest of Costa Rica and a desert of Madagascar, and they're right next to each other. So I'm interested in botanical gardens because they're a great example of simulacra. A representation of something that actually bears no resemblance to reality. So other examples include the cave paintings in France. So if you go to Lascaux, to the caves, you'll pay money to see them, but you won't actually enter the real caves. You'll go into an elaborate recreation so that the actual caves can remain safe from tourists. And this idea of the hyperreal, which of course the title of this two-person show is Hyperreal Landscape, is the inability in postmodern society right now to really distinguish reality from a simulation. So the copy becomes a truth in its own right. So in all the upcoming images of installations and prints that I'm going to show you, the imagery is based mostly on the Cleveland Botanical Garden and a few from a few other similar kinds of places. I'm also interested very much in this idea of, or question of, what nature will look like in the future. The idea of a future ecology, one in which the human and the non-human, the simulation and the reality can no longer be distinguished, is really compelling to me, and one that and that's another idea that I keep coming back to in my work. Author Lucy Lepard says, if we fail to heal our rift with nature, it will just go on without us. New species will arise to replace those we have killed off. We need nature. Nature doesn't need us. It will simply be a different world. Nature takes what it is given, but is likely to fight back in unexpected ways, end quote. And so that's where I get really interested in this idea of a future ecology, one that there's a question mark. Are there humans in this, or just the remnants of humans, and raising some of those kinds of questions. So I'm trained as a printmaker and essentially trained as a 2D artist. So at the same time that I'm trying to think sculpturally to create these installations, I'm also trying to think, like a painter or like a 2D artist, how can I use color to create more depth than what is really there? How can I use color and form to create the illusion of movement and play with the surface? So, formally, I'm very interested in playing with that, going back and forth between actual space and pictorial space. I cut into the banners, I cut into the installations a lot. I mean, I do this with my prints too, so that the images become really layered in space. And this is another work called Vanishing Points. And the title refers to this question of, at what point is everything we know going to vanish ecologically? And this is the back of the work. It's printed, a pigment print on transparent backlight film. So when it's lit from the front, you can still see the image on the back because the material is slightly transparent. I manipulate a lot of the images that I take at the botanical gardens so that they look blurred or out of focus. I'm going to read another quote to you here. This is from the painter Gerhard Richter. He says, I blur things because it makes all things equally important and equally unimportant. It all becomes background, end quote. And that really seemed like a perfect way to me to describe this idea of not showing a subject, but showing a whole environment, not prioritizing the man-made architecture in these spaces, or the plants, or the lighting, or the watering system, or whatever is there, but to make everything equally important and equally unimportant. So starting with this piece, which is called Hanging Gardens, I started to give a lot of the installations a bluish color, and I'm trying to reference cyanotype. And I started to really think about how the cutouts, before I was thinking of the cutouts sculpturally, but I started to think about how the cutouts also actually flatten the image. It reminds you that this is not a pictorial space that you can enter, that it's actually just a sheet of paper or a sheet of film. It's actually just a flat surface. And the cutout actually very much draws attention to that. So like a botanical garden, you realize that it's really, really fake. So this is the back of that piece. And I'm also just interested in this idea that you have to fully walk around it in order to understand the piece. So this piece, Conservatory, again, it creates a really frontal space that's very image oriented and almost kind of, I think, seductive or beautiful. But as you navigate around it, this is the back, it creates a very different space that is more sculptural, and its constructedness becomes revealed. This was a piece that I had at OYG Projects in Brooklyn a couple summers ago. And these were in a two-person show in the fall of 2019 with artist J. Lee Garcia in Ashland, Ohio. And then this is the piece, Fruitful, that's in the exhibition now at Broward College. And I'm just starting to play around with using canvas. So you can see my transition from printing on film to printing on very thin Japanese papers for these installations to now I'm starting to play around with canvas because I'm really interested in how canvas drapes very differently. It's softer, it's not as stiff as paper. And trying to make it through the cutting, trying to make the work drape in some more interesting ways. So at certain places it's very stiff, and at other places it kind of flops over and becomes more sculptural. So at the same time that I'm making installations, I'm also always making prints on paper. And these also all refer to the Cleveland Botanical Garden. So I use the layering that is really inherent to printmaking to make it look like you're looking through many layers in the prints. So I want to make it look like you're looking through windows and looking through reflections, and that whatever experience you're having, whatever you're looking at, is a very mediated experience with many layers to it. And I'm also trying to create a somewhat confusing visual space where the viewer is left to ask, what's inside and what's outside? Am I inside? Am I outside? What's the viewpoint I'm looking at this landscape through? And I also try to, make the page start to feel overgrown. Like I almost always print to the edges of a sheet of paper rather than having a margin, because I want it to feel like these plants might just grow right off the page, and have them feel quite overgrown. So in a lot of these, I started to cut into the paper itself as well. So in this piece, you can see the fencing at the top, and where it's white there at the top between the fencing, there's actually nothing there. It's completely cut away, and that's hand cut, just like all the installations are. So it becomes sort of delicate, almost like lace. And this piece is the same way. It's actually 2 prints that are both very cut out, very delicately, and then collaged together. So when you pick it up, it's quite fragile and quite dimensional actually too, and very layered, just like the installations are. I think a lot of these feel like a bit like an after image or a hallucination. And so the titles refer to that idea that what you're seeing might not really be what you're seeing. So they have titles like Daydream and Mirage. And Otherworldly. So this is the most recent work. I just finished this in December of 2020, and it's in the show. And it's really dealing with the same ideas. So, you know, I've been working with very similar ideas for quite a few years now, but I am excited that the work just keeps evolving. So thanks.
Thank you, Taryn. So I'm sure that some of you have questions, but let's hold the questions till the end after Mary Claire goes, and then you can ask to both. So if you'd stop share. Thank you. And you ready, Mary Claire?
Yes, I am.
All right.
Thank you so much to Angel and to the Rosemary Duffy Larson Gallery for this opportunity. And it's especially exciting to be showing with Taryn. We are absolutely kindred spirits and have a lot of really similar themes running through our work. And it just feels like I really cannot imagine like a better pairing of someone who I would like to show work with. So I just feel very honored for the opportunity and excited to nerd out about fake nature. So I'll go ahead and start my PowerPoint here. So my beginning slide is a still from a video animation that's up in the show at the gallery. This animation is called Hypernature, and it was made in response to ideas by actually one of the same theorists who Taryn mentioned in her talk, named Timothy Morton, who talks a lot about not only sort of like the mesh, the interconnected web of nature, and how that is so much sort of larger than the definitions of nature that we pigeonhole ourselves into. But he also talks a lot about strategies for kind of making peace with the beauty of that sort of stereotypical Western definition of nature, as well as accepting the reality that it is limiting and that it doesn't leave us with much of anywhere to go in the Anthropocene era. So Taryn talked about how we often think of ourselves as being outside of nature, and nature as being this sort of like beautiful thing that we put up on the pedestal in the tradition of the Romantic poets and the Hudson River School of painters. And we simply cannot continue thinking of nature that way if we are to have a sustainable future, if humans are to be able to survive climate change. We need to figure out how to conceptualize ourselves as being a part of the system in order to cohabitate with the system. And so he talks in some of his writings about, you know, what do we do with our current cultural paradigms of nature with the awareness that it's time for a shift? How do we kind of like mourn that transition into a new cultural definition? Another theorist who talks about this a lot is Donna Haraway. And the two of them are sort of the philosophers and theorists who I read a lot as sort of my research for what I'm working on in the studio. And Timothy Morton talks about this idea of critical kitsch, that this sort of antiquated idea of nature is very kitschy, but it's charming and beautiful and it's nostalgic, sort of in the same way, like a little tchotchke that's, you know, a ceramic deer that's on the mantelpiece at your grandmother's house. It's sort of sweet and endearing, And it's very sort of self-referential in its beauty and in its sort of idealized appeal, but it's a little bit sort of void of meaning. It's void of new meaning. It's sort of referencing past ideas. And so I really latched onto this idea of critical kitsch and the idea of embracing like the saccharine beauty of contemporary and sort of like romantic era up to now renditions of nature in the arts as well as in pop culture and in internet media as my form of critical kitsch. So I'm starting with the work. This work is not included at the show that's up at Rosemary, Duffy, Larson, but this is really the piece that led me to the current body of work that I'm doing now, which is based on Dutch Golden Age still lifes around the theme of Tulip Mania. And that's the common theme in all of my works within the Hyperreal landscape exhibition. But this is sort of the piece that started that body of work, and it's titled Wallpaper for Digital Botanists. And in this piece, I was investigating both the border between the natural and the artificial, and also the border between the physical and the virtual. So this piece was actually a wallpapered room that you would step inside of. So I built, I think it was 8 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet. It was a cube that you stepped inside of, and we're completely overwhelmed by this repeating pattern that sort of stretched and warped in some places. It feels like just very bubbly, happy wallpaper, but then there's stripes of it that become distorted and stretched, and it really starts to confuse your sense of balance, and it becomes difficult to position yourself within this strange, overwhelming, viney, floral landscape. And I like to think of this piece sort of as like what it might feel like to step into a digital image of the idea of nature. So as the color layers sort of warp and pull apart, it's sort of this immersive environment, this immersive installation that's almost sort of nauseating. And I think I'm crossing my fingers that this video is going to play. Here we go. So the video animation is on the outside of the wall, and then you sort of stepped in, and I had these color changing spotlights. So that sort of made the image continually pulse around you. So this installation seeks to simulate in real space a virtual reality experience of decorative flora. And I'm curious about digital images, but also specifically about photos on social media, how these things function as real-time as replacements for real-time interactions with our physical environment. So I have a lot more experiences of looking at other people's photographs of hikes in the wilderness or beautiful bouquets or pictures of their gardens. Like I experience so much more variety of nature imagery through social media than I do by actually sort of like going out and leaving my urban environment. And that was definitely one of the things I was considering while making this piece. And that piece was part of a larger exhibition that was called the Scenic Unreal, which also featured sculptures that were each based on a different painting from the Hudson River School. I have the same photo reference here, the Thomas Cole's view from Mount Holyoke, as sort of an exemplar of like what Americans think of when we think of beautiful nature. The Hudson River School and Rocky Mountain School painters, that imagery was sort of very essential to like American nationalist identity during the time of Manifest Destiny. So there's some definitely, there's a lot of beauty in these paintings, but there's also a lot of darkness in them because they ended up being used sort of as advertisements, encouraging European settlers to move west and take over more land and conquer more land as we sort of built this new republic with its centers of industry. And it was sort of this idea of America as like expansive, never-ending natural resources. And so I think that comes back to that critical kitsch, that sort of push and pull of something that's like saccharine, sweet, and beautiful, but that's also so much more complicated than our initial takeaways from beauty are. And so from each of those paintings, I recreated a small three-dimensional sculpture, so a little miniature diorama. And the idea is that I'm not referencing the natural world itself. I'm specifically referencing the imagery and like the cultural representation of nature in that painting. So I'm looking at the painting, which is a painting of a natural space, and recreating my three-dimensional space based on that two-dimensional picture plane. And then each of the pedestals that these sculptures sit on is a large scale inkjet print that's a pixelated version of the same painting. So when you see it from really, really far away, you can recognize, oh, that's Thomas Cole's view from Mount Holyoke. But the closer you get to it, the more it distorts and becomes complicated. And I'm seeing that as sort of a metaphor for like when you step within the mesh, that like beautiful picture kind of dissipates and disappears as you sort of merge with it and become part of it. But as seen from far away, when you're seeing yourself as separate, it's this sort of little, trinket that you could hold in your hand. This one is based on another painting, Mount Corcoran, after Albert Bierstadt. And then this is, I'm transitioning into talking about the Tulip Mania series of work that's featured in the show. So I thought for a long time and did a lot of work based on those Hudson River School and Rocky Mountain School images. And then I started reading and doing some research about the Dutch Golden Age still lifes. I was also thinking about this idea of landscape painting and nature painting as sort of a manifestation of our use of natural resources. So during the period of time when during the Dutch Golden Age, when these paintings, these still life paintings of flowers were so popular, the Netherlands was really becoming sort of a global superpower. So they were colonizing a lot of places. They were sailing off in ships and bringing back goods to Europe. And a lot of wealthy merchants who were amassing sort of a lot of goods and objects from overseas were commissioning these beautiful still life paintings of sort of like examples of decadence. And flowers had special monetary significance in Dutch culture, particularly these variegated tulips that were called Semper Augustus tulips. So tulips were like a fad that was sweeping across the Netherlands. And the variegated tulips were especially particularly prized because they were rare. And the reason why they were rare is that the thing creating those stripes is not actually a feature of the tulip itself. It's a virus called, it's actually, the category of virus is called the mosaic virus. And that virus created the variegations in the tulip, but it also made it harder for the tulip to reproduce. So as time went on, it was like the thing that made the flower beautiful was also the thing that made it a bad investment, because you would never recoup the money that you had spent on, like from an economic standpoint, you couldn't recoup the money that you had spent because you couldn't use what you had purchased to propagate more tulips. And I thought that this was a very fitting metaphor for sort of the not exactly senseless, but the sort of like aimless arbitrariness of how beauty motivates our interactions with the natural world. And so I really latched onto these paintings that featured the Semper Augustus tulips as a way to explore that. And these images are also kind of my engagement with the idea of the sort of like the cultural image versus the original object or the original artifact. So, you know, the artist who created these paintings was looking at a bouquet and working from the original object to create a replica of what they saw. And now I'm looking at that artist's work, and there's my printmaking process for these artworks, there's so many steps of translation. So I'm looking at the painting, I'm tracing those lines, I'm scanning them into the computer, I'm looking at the image in Photoshop, and I'm warping it and I'm changing it to create these areas of pixelation and distortion, adding various filters in Photoshop and changing the colors. And then I'm outputting that from the computer. I'm tracing it again. I'm moving it onto a block of linoleum and carving each color layer meticulously. And so every time that image makes another move as part of my process, it's getting farther and farther away from its original source, which was the flower. And I'm also thinking of that as a metaphor for sort of my experience of digitally mediated nature. So those photographs that I'm looking at on Instagram of other people's experiences of the natural world, sort of being constantly sorted through a filter as they become farther distanced from the original and closer to me. So I also started thinking about my obsession with sort of the digital versus the physical. I started a collaboration with a robot. This piece is a collaboration between me and the laser cutter at my academic institution. So this print is 4 layers. It's 4 prints that are printed on top of each other to create this range of colors. And the key image, which is the black lined work, that layer was created by me. All of the color layers are created by a laser cutter machine. It's an Epilogue laser cutter. And I created a digital file, an Adobe Illustrator file of halftone dots of where I want all the colors to fall in the image. I send that information to the laser cutter, and the laser cutter carves that information out of a block of wood that I can then roll up in ink and print on an old-timey etching press. So I'm kind of taking the most sort of modern form of printmaking that I can imagine and combining it with something that's no longer like a current technology, but is now considered sort of an artisan's practice, a fine arts practice. So really playing with our translation of images through media. And here's a close-up where you can see sort of all of the little halftone dots that are the cyan, magenta, and yellow layers coming together to mix and blend and form other colors. And this is the same way that images like in a newspaper or a magazine are printed. So the installation piece that's included in the Hyperreal Landscape Show started out as individual flowers from my flat prints that I then enlarged and cut out on the enlarged, changed the colors, screen printed, and then cut out on the same laser cutter machine to create these movable parts so that I could create this immersive landscape that is sort of mixing the wobbliness and the sort of loss of sense of self that I was so interested in with that earlier wallpaper installation that I showed at the beginning, to sort of mix that immersive experience with some of the themes that I was exploring in the Oh, oops, it wouldn't let me go back. Some of the themes that I was sharing in these works. And so that's where I am now. And my next project after this exhibition, my next project is that I'm hoping to create large scale screen printed wallpaper of some of these same designs from the Dutch Golden Age paintings. So this feels like fruitful territory, and I just feel so honored to be able to show it alongside another artist whose work I admire so much. That's it.
Thank you so much. So does anyone at home have any questions for either Taryn or Mary Claire? You can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type in the chat too. Okay, so I have from Georgetta, question to both artists. Just wondering if you have read Elizabeth Gilbert's The Signature of All Things. The main character is a scientist in botany. I thought that book may become a source of inspiration for a new body of work.
I have not read that, but that sounds super interesting. Thanks for the suggestion. Yeah.
I have some of Elizabeth Gilbert's other books on my reading list that I haven't gotten to yet. And so I'm now copy pasting your suggestion from the chat and adding it to my reading list. So thank you.
Any other questions or inspirational suggestions? That book is very good. Georgetta had recommended it to me. I enjoyed it. Again, you can unmute or raise your hand if it doesn't let you unmute, or type in the chat.
I just wanted to say hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say excellent presentations from both of you. I think the work is marvelous. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rod.
By the way, I have my students also watching, so
Great, thank you.
I'm sure they're learning and enjoying this a lot. So yeah.
For sure. Kyle asks in the chat to Taryn, how do you make the cuts on your work? By laser or by hand?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the big installations, those are all cut by hand because the work doesn't fit in any laser cutter that I have access to. So I do all that by hand, and actually I'm pretty fast by hand. I've gotten so, because I do it so much, I've gotten so fast by hand that I actually think it's a lot of times it's faster than for me it would be to make a digital file and, you know, take it to a laser cutter to have it do it, unless I was for some reason wanted to mass produce the same thing of, you know, the same image cut out 100 times, which I don't usually do. I'm usually doing, you know, unique things. I cut out an image and then I move on to something else. So, but in the prints, there are some pieces that are cut by a plotter and then layered, or there's sometimes a stencil that's used, that's cut by a plotter that I use in the monotype to resist the ink in certain places. And the plotter, it's very similar to a laser cutter, but it's way, way, way lower tech. So it's just a, you know, an arm that moves on an XY axis with an X-Acto blade in it. And so sometimes I use that to cut things out in the prints, but all the installations pieces are cut by hand. And I've been cutting stuff out for, you know, I can trace the first time I started printing, you know, this kind of imagery. I didn't show any of this work, but I started doing that kind of thing of cutting things out and making these kinds of installations back in like 2006, 2007, when I'm sure laser cutters, I'm sure they existed. I don't know, but I certainly didn't have access to one, and it wasn't something that was on my radar at all. So I started by hand and sort of, you know, figured out that those things are there, and I use them sometimes. But for me, cutting things out, it's like drawing. I just do it.
Thank you. And Kyle says, wow, thanks. And Georgetta says, beautiful work and great and informative presentations. Congratulations. Susanna asks, says, hi, Taryn, what makes Cleveland's Botanical Garden your main point of inspiration? Accessibility, I'm sure, plays a role proximity-wise.
Yeah, definitely proximity, because I've gone to other botanical gardens. Actually, like I said, I've been doing this work about, that has included imagery based on plants since about 2006, 2007, and installations and cutouts. But I really sort of started to pivot to botanical gardens around 2015 when I did a residency in Berlin, and while I was at the residency in Berlin, I went to the Berlin Botanical Garden, which is one of the largest botanical gardens in the world. And I spent so much time there photographing, and while I was making my work at the residency. And then when I came back, I started to use those images in my work. So, and since then I've photographed other botanical gardens, but the Cleveland Botanical Garden is right near me. And I think that that's really purely what makes it such a point of inspiration, is because I love it. I love that space. I love that, I live in this area, and it's a place for me that's like, that I love to go to and immerse myself in. And I think it's a place that I connect to. So that's why I keep going back to it. I always tell people I grew up in New Jersey in a very kind of working class neighborhood. I grew up, if you heard my talk before, you might have heard me say I grew up, the park 2 blocks away from my house where I grew up was called the Deal Test Site. And I did not think it was strange that the park was a former, military test site, and that that's what it was called. And so I think my experiences with the natural world, I didn't have a lot of what I would necessarily think of as like an authentic experience with the natural world. I had experiences with places that were very highly mediated. And so then as I started to, have more experiences with the natural world, after grad school, I went on a road trip out west and saw some of the national parks for the first time, and started to realize that actually those spaces are very highly mediated as well. Like, you're told what path is the best path. You're told where all the beautiful vistas are. And so I just became very interested in that. And so I guess my work for me has always been sort of personal, and even though it's about these larger ideas, it's also very personal to me and my experience. And so the Cleveland Botanical Garden is, again, it's just a place that's very personal to me and my experiences.
That's amazing. Thanks so much. And Teresa had responded to the hand cutting, saying it feels like you are more involved with the work in that way. And I think people that do come and see, the images are available for anyone to see at browardvpa.com, but anyone that can come in person, there is a very tactile, personal feeling to the work, for sure. Jenna says, Mary Claire, what is the most important thing that you hope your audience will learn or ponder on after seeing your work?
I guess just sort of questioning those traditional or stereotypical definitions of what nature is, and asking yourself, where does that idea of nature come from? And just thinking about how our culture influences our understanding of the natural world, and thinking about going forwards, how can we sort of respect and continue to appreciate the sweetness and beauty of the ways that we idealize it, while also making room for new understandings, and sort of letting other things start to infiltrate that box that we call nature. So thinking about how can technology sort of become part of nature moving forward, because that sort of does feel like our virtual worlds and our physical worlds are getting very blurred. And I think that is one of the reasons why this is the subject that I continue coming back to.
Thank you. Any other questions for either Mary Claire or Taryn? Well, I want to say that after spending a week very intimately with the work, bringing it, putting it up, arranging it, I've started to notice similar imagery all around me that I just haven't been paying attention to. I was like washing my face in my bathroom and I look up and there's a vase in there and it has flowers represented very much in that way that Mary Claire, you've been representing flowers. And then I was looking at a shirt my mom was wearing and I'm like, those look like the silhouettes in Taryn's work. And I've had that vase, my mom has had that shirt. But so many representations of nature are all over our man-made things. And it was not something I noticed before. So it's really interesting to see those connections.
Yeah, I collaborated with a botanist a couple years ago, someone who teaches at Kent State, and she was telling me, I found it so fascinating because she saw my work from a completely different perspective, and she was telling me about how they think biologically, you know, we want to be surrounded by the natural world and we want to be surrounded by these images, because if there's plants and there's water, then there's food and we're probably fairly safe. And it's extremely comforting, and that's kind of hardwired into us to want to surround ourselves with this stuff. And yet she was saying at the same time, there's this phenomenon called plant blindness that I was really fascinated by, where she said, you know, at the same time, if you show somebody a picture that's mostly, you know, plants, and there's like a tiny parrot in the middle, and you ask people, what is in this picture? They'll say a parrot, because we are also at the same time, we're biologically hardwired, maybe, it's not, I don't think it's proven, but to see these things as backdrop and to want them to be our backdrop, but to also see them as backdrop. So, you know, I find that really, really interesting. And so, yeah, same thing, I see them everywhere. And sometimes I feel like I'm just staying one step ahead, barely, of target, you know, so.
Susanna asks, hi, Mary Claire, how do you hang your installation of cut floral prints?
Well, in this particular case, and this is actually the next thing I was going to say, is I owe Angel so much for making this installation happen. When Taryn and I proposed this show, I assumed that we would be traveling down and installing in person and doing our talk, because I don't know that I would have ever asked someone to install that piece for me, thinking that they were going to have to do the whole thing without me. Each print, I mean, I haven't actually counted. I don't know how many individual prints it is, but each of those prints are individually tacked to the wall with entomology specimen pens. So these like long skinny pens that are used in like museum displays of bugs. And so you like hammer a little pin to attach the print to the wall, and then sort of like curve the print around so it pops off of the wall a little bit. And if you look in photos of the work, you can see that the prints are sort of dimensionally coming off of the wall, and they're just sort of pinned between those entomology pins so that they're hovering above the surface.
It was actually a lot of fun to hang. It was this very obsessive, like I feel like I'm seeing flowers in my dreams. So thank you for trusting us with that, and I'm glad we were able to do it. I know it's hard with everything going on, but I wanted to, make sure that I brought both of your, pieces to the gallery for everyone to enjoy. So thank you.
You did an amazing job, and you also took amazing photographs of it. So yes, thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So any other questions tonight? Right, well, thank you so much, Mary Claire and Taryn. And again, the exhibition is visible on browardvpa.com and in person at the Rosemary Duffy Larson Gallery at Broward College, through April 7th. We're going to be closed the 1st through the 6th for spring break, but other than that, feel free to stop by. Thank you so much for coming tonight, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Angel. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, my class, go back to Zoom. My class.
Thanks, Red.
Get back to class.
Back to class.
Zoom class.